Good morning, Joyce. Super happy to have you here today. How are you doing?
Good. Good morning, Julian. How are you?
I am doing great. Super excited to have you here because I've had the chance to work with you in the past. That unfortunately was shorter than I hoped for, but it was super inspiring. So when I had the chance to have you on the interview seat, I really wanted to take that chance. Maybe I start with a quick intro, if that's good for you.
Yeah, sounds good.
So tell me if I get anything wrong, but you started your career as a consultant, which is something that's pretty obvious because there are many things in the way you tackle problems that you can tell you've been a consultant, you've been around for a while.
Yes.
I can see that also in the way you engage in cross-department kind of problem solving. There is something of a consultant here. You've had an incredibly fast growth at Box, where looks like you've had promotion over promotion over promotion. So there must be something you've done incredibly well there. You've spent a few years at Adobe after that. Then you were VP marketing back at RingCentral, and now, congratulations, you're the CMO of Dropbox. That's a pretty impressive role, a pretty impressive career you've got here. Did I miss something? Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's been great in terms of the career path, and a lot of it is hard work, but equally so, a lot of great mentors along the way.
Was any of that planned? Did you tell yourself 10 years ago, in 10 years time, I'll be not necessarily CMO of Dropbox, but I'll be CMO of a SaaS company, or that's where I want to be? Was that planned?
No, I would say it's probably less planned than, and it's been adapting my career aspirations along the way. And I'd say even what a marketing leader today it looks like is very different than it was 5 or 10 years ago. So if you ask me when I graduated, whether it's undergrad or business school, I never imagined this is where I'd land.
Actually, that is very true. The role of a CMO, the role of marketing actually has changed tremendously a bit over the past 5, 10, 15 years. It is pretty good that you've got that technical / data mindset, because that must be incredibly useful today, way more than it was a few years ago, I guess.
Yeah, so if I look back to when I learned data analytics, actually my very first project in consulting, I was asked to learn SQL. And I remember when I was the first analyst, first job out of undergrad, you're just like, what is this? And never did I know, fast forward over a decade to later, how useful that skill set would be. And just the analytical mindset, but being able to synthesize it into action, that's been incredibly powerful, especially in the modern day era of everything digital. Everything can be captured through data. And if anything, the problem nowadays is more making sure you don't get analysis paralysis.
And you got a lot of these skills from your early days in the consultancy world. Why did you leave that? Why did you decide, okay, I've been a consultant for a while, now it's time to get into marketing and actually not advise company, but work directly from within the companies? Why the jump?
Yeah, it's actually 2 different reasons. One was a lifestyle choice. As you get further up the ladder in consulting, you're on the plane more, you're traveling more, and it's really hard to start a family at that age when you're constantly on the plane. The second was, as you kind of got further higher, you're more kind of at the steering level. And I really miss being closer to the action, being able to still solve and own accountability to the problems. So that's when I started to realize it was starting to disconnect with what keeps me motivated and passionate. Then to your second question of how I got to marketing, that was a follow the yellow brick road type of evolution. It was not my first inclination. It was actually when my first role at Box was business analytics across go-to-market, including sales and channel and marketing. And then I eventually, over time, landed into marketing by process of elimination, saying, I know I would like to be closer to the customer, but I really, I don't fancy owning a bag and selling. So I really loved the multifaceted aspect of marketing where there's the brand component, but there's also the digital component that is very data oriented. And it really played to the strengths of how I was trained as a consultant, which is the strategy and ops really coalescing together.
So what did you keep from these early days as a consultant? What is it you're still using today? What skills did you acquire this many years ago that are still useful in a CMO role today?
Yeah, I would say the first and foremost is problem solving. And to be very specific, the first week of any consulting company, they take you into a training campground. And it's really to develop and hone in on your skills of a hypothesis-based approach. And why that's even more important now in marketing is, as any marketer knows, you always get asked to do more. It's a constant drumbeat. Every time you plan, it probably within days afterwards, you're asked additional scope. So the consulting basis is really twofold. One is like, it makes you stay focused on what are the paths and hypotheses of ultimately solving the problem statement at hand. So it's the skill set of being very articulate of how you frame it, and then how you go about approaching the problem so that you maintain focus and not get pulled in 101 different ways. The second component is actually later in my consulting career, where you're more of the engagement manager and you're very focused on scoping. And the scope is important because in consulting with SOWs, at the end of that engagement, one way or another, you have to have delivered something, because there's no, day 101. So with that in mind, that's where, in terms of the marketing transferable skill set through planning, whether it's the annual, quarterly, or even on a strategic engagement, you really learn to stay focused and make sure that, yes, you collect feedback, but like maybe you evolve it to a phase 2, or what are the trade-offs and how do you facilitate that conversation? Because we're always living in a finite world of resources. So it's either you have to make trade-offs and then change the objectives, or do you keep the objectives and find a different path of how you accomplish that?
And that is definitely something that whatever company you're working for in marketing has to be useful, because whether you have tons of marketing budget or very limited resources, making the trade-offs and deciding what's going to be important for you this quarter or this year is definitely a skill. Prioritizing, it's always an issue in marketing, so definitely something that's going to help you out.
I would say even more so in recent years, like pre-COVID years during the ZERP era, when everything was, marketing would get a lot of budget, and so would all the other functions. And there wasn't as much scrutiny behind the bottom line. Now, if you fast forward to post-COVID, where everything is settling down in the macroeconomics, every CFO is putting pressure on whether it's marketing or product or sales on efficiency. So you have to be focused on driving top and bottom line.
So I believe from your marketing path, I can probably say without a mistake that being a marketer was not your dream job as a kid. So what was your dream job as a kid? What did you hope to accomplish? And how far are you from that original dream?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because I kept changing. I mean, there was one point in my childhood when I wanted to be a pop star because I loved, and I'm tone deaf for the record, but I loved watching performers sing and dance, and it just made me very happy. And then if I think about at the point of when it was first kind of foray before starting into consulting, there was a moment in which I thought about, should I consider banking or should I consider corporate development? A little bit more tilt on the financial side. And ultimately what dissuaded me there was I felt it was almost too anchored in the numbers, and it wasn't close enough to talking to customers and really understanding what motivates people in terms of a purchase.
So going from being a performer to being a banker, and marketing was just a middle ground. That makes sense when you look at it this way. So, but you also have kids today. They're a bit too young to choose a career.
Yes.
But do you think you're going to push them, or would you be delighted if they were to choose a marketing career, or would you prefer something else for them?
I would prefer whatever gives them a lot of passion. That's what helped me land to marketing, candidly. So if I use that as my primary criteria, that's what I would encourage. And candidly, the careers that we see now, it's going to be so different by the time they're in the workforce. And even in the, call it past decade or two, even within marketing, like data science was not a thing back then. And now it's like well past data science. Now the next wave I see as the new career paths is like prompt engineers with AI. So it's just very interesting to see the evolution of careers. And I always draw back to what we talked about earlier is what are your transferable skill sets so that you can be that chameleon and understanding how do you adapt with how the industry and career paths evolve.
So it's interesting that you talk about all this skill that would be transferable. You've been doing data, you're great with numbers, you have that consulting skills, you've worked in digital roles, you've worked in campaign roles, you've worked in MOPS at some point, so you understand how all the flows and everything work. Is that, if not the entire secret, is that part of the secret sauce to success, diversification, touching a little bit of everything if you want to grow in your marketing career?
So that's a really great question. That wasn't intentional of the different teams that you listed, and they have been added skill sets to each of the evolution, spanning from all those teams, including the creative teams, to flex that muscle. The one thing I always ask myself when I look for the next opportunity is, do I have that 1 or 2 degrees of pivot that allows me to grow? And that's what I really ultimately look for. So I don't always necessarily look for titles per se, or number of employees, or what different criteria that might be a little bit more hard metrics, ironically, given my data side. I really look at like, what have I learned to date that I can apply? And is there something that stretches me a little bit, but not so much that I'd be set up for failure, where I still have a portion or a swath of my scope that I know I can bring to the table and add value to the company. And then is there another portion of scope where I'm allowed to grow within kind of that degrees of pivot, where it's enough for me to be different, but enough that I know I can transfer knowledge and my know-how to how do I apply to this new domain expertise.
So it's like a deal with the employer saying, I got 80% of my knowledge is definitely going to be applicable and help you out, but the last 20%, I'm going to need you to help me get that 20%. So that it's a win-win. I'm going to help you grow your company, but I'm going to grow my own.
And I think nowadays the reason why, and obviously you can't go in aggressive and ask for it up front being in the negotiations, but I look out for those roles and really think about curating my narrative against those and why I would still be competent and confident in delivering. And if you think of even the modern day CMO search, and I was really upfront, close and personal with this, whether it was Box or otherwise, is it's really hard to find a marketing leader that checks every single box. As I draw upon like past CMOs at different companies, they often heavily tilt towards either they came out from the brand marketing route or more of the demand gen route. And it's not to say it's binary. I think it's an and statement in the modern day era. But in terms of, you look at your historical experience, as in more traditionally what's on your resume, you don't always have somebody that says, yes, I have 10 years in brand and 10 years in demand, and made it all beautifully, like checking every single box. And even what the companies look for, you add in the complexity of the stage of company that they're at, and specifically at Dropbox is they're a public company going through making sure they adhere to the rule of 40, like how they even further frame that criteria. It's different in terms of what they're optimizing for. So going back to your question, I focus on what are the top things that are there must-haves, and it might be in terms of where I'm looking for in growth, are there nice-to-haves?
So to your point, for many people, for many marketers, there is a point in your career where you are at a crossroad and you need to decide whether you want to be hyper specialized, you want to be the absolute expert when it comes to SEM, SEO, branding, whatever it is, or actually say, okay, I've done enough of that, and it's about time I try something different and learn some new skills. So are you saying to new marketers that actually want to climb that ladder, the best is to try a little bit of the branding side of thing and a little bit of the digital lead gen side of thing, because you're going to need both if you really want to grow?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to your question with my daughter as well, is first and foremost, I ask, like, what are you most passionate about? Because it's not for everybody's cup of tea to keep climbing that ladder. At some point, some people are like, you know what, I really thrive in my specialty of demand or search, and I want to keep growing. And especially with search and the technology nowadays, there's so much regulations and technological platforms that keep evolving. So you can go that route in terms of being an industry SME and a rock star in your own right. Then there's the other path which you're alluding to, which is like going a little bit more depth and breadth, which is ultimately the CMO route. And in that regard, I would say, like, if not direct experience, have at least the listening ears and empathy of understanding, how does my job impact downstream processes, as well as what are the inputs that I depend on and the work that I plan to get into the upstream processes. So again, a bit drawing into my consulting background is understanding from the step-to-step and process flow, from start of planning, strategy, activation and execution, measure and optimize. Do I understand all the puts and takes of people, process, deliverables, and technologies through that? So that's something that I would encourage, if you don't have hard experience in, at a minimum, make sure you do that listening tour and do that education and understand how everything works together.
I love that you're saying that, because I agree that's way more than just the skills of being able to do something, but there is also an element of understanding. I mean, marketing is such a broad type of team that you've got people with completely different background working on completely different things. But at the end of the day, they all report into the same org, and they have the same top KPI that, depending on the company, could be revenue, pipe, or whatever that would be. But ultimately, we're all working the same team here. But since we don't have the same day job, the same objectives, the same way of working, having that experience where you sit in other people's chair for a while, you actually can talk to them, understand, put yourself in their shoes, and have more intelligent conversation.
And I would say what's something that is interesting as I observed through my career is the further up you go within marketing, the more you actually spend that learning other people's processes outside of marketing. As in, I very much need to understand, how does the finance process work? When are they expected to give me a plan, a budget? How are they holding me accountable? And how do they back in items like rolling thunder, or for those that use different terminology, is like in quarter, they're trying to land an EPS and they find out they have extra dollars to spend. So understanding those puts and takes of the processes. If you're in a PLG company, knowing how does growth and product operate and what are the interdependencies, particularly teams like LCM are hyper pulled into growth priorities. Then on an SLG, a sales-led company, being tied at the hip with sales is ever so important, particularly in the field marketing side, where you might even go so far as mirroring their org structure so that there's alignment at their RVP level. I remember at one point when I was earlier in my career with Box, and one of the early days of really getting into the interlock between sales and marketing, there was a week when I shadowed a BDR every single day. So I would actually very much understand, how do they follow up on leads? What is the enablement they're given? What are the outreach sequences they're equipped? And I would literally sit next to them so I could see how they operated in Outreach.io or Salesforce. That was the extent where I really wanted to understand what happens after the lead.
So shifting to a slightly different conversation, I'd like to talk for a second about team management. And before I do so, I said as an intro that now you're a CMO at Dropbox. I happen to be a big fan of Dropbox because that's a service I've been using for over a decade to structure my life The fact that you can have everything from your computer to your cell phone, and that all your photos and papers and whatever you need is now available in your phone. That's something I've always loved about the company. But beyond the product, there is something that Dropbox is quite famous for, if I'm not mistaken. They are not a remote company because of the pandemic. They are a remote company by design. And how does that work for you? How does it, because as a CMO, you manage an international team. So whether in the office or not, anyway, you're going to have people all over the world. But how does it work for a manager managing so many people in so many places to be fully remote? Is it a plus? Is it an obstacle? And how do you do that on a daily basis?
Net, it's a plus. The summary is it's an adjustment, but it was actually a big component of the recruiting process of why I picked Dropbox. And there's a lot of actual statistics for why a lot of candidates pick Dropbox for that exact reason. I think there's the pluses. You're not restrained to recruiting talent in certain markets. And I think that opens up an aperture of how you can curate and build your team, which is wonderful. The main thing is always needing to intentionally plan. How do you still have those water cooler moments that we used to be very accustomed to? And one thing that I think Dropbox does incredibly well is it does a retrospective of, did we get, like, what else have we learned to continue to optimize this culture? And they're very candid to say, look, we are going all in. We might not get it right the first time, but what we're going to commit to is learning what needs to be improved. So they even since announced, like, we're virtual first. I think it was a year and a bit afterwards, they did a study and survey across their own employees and actually summarized all their lessons learned and adapted. There's certain mechanisms in place of what they budget for, even on the hard dollars in the budget for once a quarter. How do we do in-person offsites? So they are incredibly intentional for when we do meet. What can you do and focus on that you can't do virtually? So I really appreciate that fine balance of, yes, you're virtual first, but for significant moments like planning, that's where it's really important to have those in-person discussions across broader teams.
So how you were talking about these water cooler moments that you typically have in a traditional in-office job that you typically have with the people who are actually in the same office, because for international companies it might be difficult anyway to have those water cooler moments. But what do you do to have that with your team, with the people you work with on a daily basis?
Yeah, there's all these little tactics, and I'd say do what's most authentic to you. But there's even simple things that I've seen some of the folks on my leadership team do is, kicking off with the leadership team meetings of, like, top surprises for the week or top ups and downs, so that you still have moments where you're not just back to back talking about the content or the work. And I think this is where there are certain folks that it's important for me to build those relationships where I'll have one-on-ones and make sure we dedicate at least first 5-10 minutes where it's just catch up. And it starts with just a simple question, was like, how's your day going? How's your week going? How's your son? So being able to understand the person behind the work is still incredibly important in this virtual first environment. And I'd say it's even more important so you understand what are their personal commitments that they have, how they've been juggling their kind of all of their personal priorities. And if you're not at least empathetic to that as a leader, it makes it very challenging to make sure that they stay motivated.
So here you're talking a little bit about how to keep people engaged, motivated, working, which is more the long-term thing. But the first step is actually to hire people. What do you look for when you hire people? Are you looking at, do you start with a CV because past experiences is the most important thing? Is it about the behavior? Is it about how comfortable, the soft skills? What matters to you? And of course, it's very different from one role to the other. But generally speaking, what do you look for when hiring people for your team?
Yeah, I actually look for very similar. The opportunities that were presented to me is their hard skills in the CV are important, but I would say to a certain extent, I look for potential more so. Are they willing to listen? Have they shown experiences in which they can not only influence with authority, but without authority? Do they have a growth mindset in which they embrace failure fast, but also innovate and lesson learn? And have they shown how they've grown with potential and kind of adaptability, being open for feedback? So those are pieces that I index higher on the EQ side, particularly as it gets further higher, because I always say there's the hero managers, but I look for team leads that can really amplify what they do. Can they scale the goodness of what they think about across the team? Because at some point you're going to be managing so many people, you can't carry everybody over the line.
I'm going to pause for a second on something you just said, because it's something I haven't heard very often, but I agree wholeheartedly with it, which is influence without authority. And very often I feel like when you really want to grow in your career, don't just wait for people to promote you, because that's the time of the year and you've been working hard and you probably deserve the promotion. But being able to kind of already be in the role without being in the role and making it an obvious choice for your manager that, of course, a promotion is here for you because you are the natural leader that you should be, is probably the best strategy, not just for hiring, but also for growing within your existing org.
Yeah, I would say 2 points to that. One is back to your earlier comment about the importance of influence without authority. If you think of marketing nowadays in the MarTech stack as an example, or analytics, so much of those resources often don't sit within marketing. So to influence IT resources, why should they prioritize you to either consolidate Marketo or integrate new application? That requires ability to influence without authority. You can do the stick method, but I always say you attract more bees with honey. So I think that's a big component of what I mean by able to influence without authority, because so much of my success is contingent on, do I have the support system from cross-functional folks?
I would have tons more questions for you, but I see the clock is ticking, so I want to have one last one. If you were to talk to fresh grads, young people with 1, 2, 3 years experience in marketing, and they were wondering about what to do next in my career, what would be the best piece of advice, the best tips that you wish you had so many years ago? Or actually, maybe you don't need to wish you had, because apparently you've been very successful the way it happened. But what would be your piece of advice for young people starting a career in marketing?
Yeah, I would say first is understand your customers. It's so important, whether it's sifting through the data or the qualitative CAB feedback, hearing what the customers want and need is the heartbeat of how can you sell more? As I think in a recent leadership offsite, one of the questions that was posed to me is how would you explain your job to a 5-year-old? And my daughter's 6, so it was very easy. I just tell them, mommy tries to get people to buy things. So you need to understand the customer. The second component I would say is as you think about your career, take note of the mentors around you and the support system. I am where I am because I've had very great mentors, and they're not all in marketing. Actually, a lot of them are not. And it has shaped me in terms of those that have encouraged me to aspire for more, remind me of the development areas I constantly need to think about, but also having the kind of sounding board as you're processing your next steps and career decisions.
Okay, consider the customer. Keep that in mind at all times and find the right mentors, not necessarily within marketing, that are going to give you just the advice you need to fuel your career and grow faster. Well, thank you so much for the wisdom, Joyce. That was a super pleasant experience for me. Thank you for taking the time. I hope that was a good one for you as well.
Yes, it's always been a pleasure to chat with you, and I definitely, the feeling's mutual in terms of inspiration, in terms of being able to work with you, and I've seen you do wonderful things.
Well, thank you so much for that, Joyce. And I will definitely have the opportunity to invite you again. Thank you, and see you next time.
Bye.